Okay. And remove Adrian's spotlight. Next will be, let's see, Stephanie. Let me put Stephanie in the spotlight.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Towns, and I have been a storyteller all my life. I taught pre-K through sixth grade at Weldon School in Pasadena for about 35 years. And the last 3 of those years, I was full-time storyteller in residence, which was wonderful because I got to tell stories from pre-K all the way up through the sixth grade. And I retired a few years ago, and then COVID hit, and I haven't been around as much. And I really miss telling stories. I still tell stories to my grandchildren, but it's not the same as having a full audience. So I am looking forward to getting back into the swing of things. Hopefully, I'll be able to come out there, but I don't do a lot of night driving. So I've been telling stories for many years, and I still love it and still think it's the most important things that children and people need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Next is, Elizabeth has joined us. Let me put Elizabeth in the spotlight. There you go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Angel, out of Riverside. I am with this group for many years, not very active, unfortunately, but I do like to belong to this group. It's always something great to learn, and I like to share a few stories I have. So I'm glad to be here tonight with Zoom. Hopefully, maybe when the day would be longer, I might take the drive to Claremont. But right now, it's good to see everyone. So thank you.
Glad you could make it, and that's why we have Zoom.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Okay, I think we got everybody that's Zooming introduced. So now I'm going to spotlight the people here. And I will start, and then I'll just pass this around. So my name is John Sinclair, and I run this group, and I've been storytelling since 2003, telling stories and really enjoy it. And I'll pass it on to the next person. Oh, and I live in Ontario.
Hello, my name's October, and I am Glenn's guest today, so it's my first time here. So I'm excited to see what it's about.
Where do you live?
And I live in Rancho.
Hello, everyone. Glenn Grant. Live here in Claremont. I think I joined the story group in 2011 or something like that. Yeah, I'm looking at John for confirmation when it's my life. At any rate, my background is public speaking. So I joined the story group several years ago to because I can be a little heavy on my speaking, a little existential and a little intense. So I joined the group to try to be a little bit more what's the word? Just tell my stories in a lighter, more joyful way. So we'll try to do that tonight with a folk tale that I'm going to tell. And I live here. I think I said I'm from Claremont and live in Claremont.
Hello, I'm Ronald Chick. I live in Riverside, and I have been telling stories since 1973. And since I retired 15 years ago, I tell them anywhere and everywhere I can find that will allow me to tell a tale.
What's strange, you feel like you're talking to yourself. You see yourself. I'm Ina Haugen. I live here in Florida. I am mostly a listener. I have a grandson who's now 20, but when he was about 7, bringing him to the twice-a-year big storytelling events, and I keep coming.
Hi, I'm St. Clair, and I've been telling stories since I was in junior high school in the library club.
Okay, so everybody's been introduced. I think I'm gonna start with Zoom people. As far as telling stories. So who on Zoom has a story for us? Stephanie, is that a hand I see?
No, that's me fiddling with this,
Oh, okay.
this screen, trying to make sure I'm in the right spot. And no, I don't have a story tonight. I wasn't that prepared.
Okay,
But-
that's fine. Anybody
Okay.
else?
Sure.
Okay, so Nick, I'll put you back on spotlight and tell your story.
Well, this is a story that I ran across a long time ago, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone tell. And it has to do with one of the confusing bits of English history. You see, William of Orange was one of those kings who was famous for fighting within what was called the United Kingdom of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland and all that, because, well, frankly, his subjects didn't really like him very much. But the point was that he tended to win his wars, and so things are remembered from the viewpoint of, well, he won, didn't he? Well, this is a story that was told in Ireland about 100 years ago to a story collector, and it ended up in an American collection of Irish stories, and people went, what? Because there were some details in the story that made no sense to an American audience. So I have to explain something very silly. In the old days, and that includes the time of William of Orange, there wasn't as much difference between Ireland and Scotland as we think of now, especially politically, and they tended to be on the same side when they were fighting the English about anything, and they would fight the English about anything. So it was that part of the Jacobite rebellion, which was trying to bring back, Prince Charles and Prince Charlie and his family and all of that, every time they weren't the kings of England and Scotland and so on, had an Irish general. And in fact, there were Irish troops all over Ireland, as well as Scottish troops in Scotland, and sometimes Scottish troops in Ireland, and sometimes Irish troops in Scotland. All fighting the English, of course, because they were the bad guys. But you see, in one particular situation, William of Orange and his generals gave a defeated Irish army, an entire army, a choice. They could either swear allegiance to England and therefore to William of Orange, or they could go off to France and fight on the other side because William of Orange was fighting against the French too. Now, why he was being so generous as to let them leave is possibly because he thought they'd be as much trouble to the French as they'd been to the English. But the point is that he thought some of them would agree to swear allegiance to him, some of them would leave. In either case, they would no longer be an immediate problem. Well, the Irish army got up and to a man walked over to the French flag that had been posted next to the battlefield. And that's not quite true, except for one man, a young soldier named Rory, who simply stood there by himself, not going to the English flag and not going to the French flag. And the leader of the Irish army called out and said, Rory, what are you doing? Come join us. You're not swearing allegiance to the English, are you? He said, no. But if I go to France, I'll no longer be fighting for Ireland. And both the English and the Irish troops cried out, but you're by yourself. You don't have an army. He said, that's true. But I'd rather fight by myself against an army than join an army that I disagree with or leave a land that I love. So I'll just walk off up into the hills. And King William's general said, but you can't do that. I ask you a decision, one or the other. And he said, I'm walking off up into the hills. And what do you expect to achieve by that? Well, said Rory, you see, my way of thinking is this. Someday, and I don't know whether it'll be tomorrow or next year or in my lifetime or 500 years from now, but someday God's going to get so fed up with the English that he's going to have his angels strap on their swords and come down and fight on our side, and we're going to win. And until that day, if there are no Irish in the fight, who will they join? And Rory walked off up into the hills by himself. The Irish army that had been there did, in fact, go over to Ireland and fight, or out of Ireland into France, and to fight on the side of the French. William of Orange did beat the French, as he'd beaten the Irish and the Scots. But you know, a few hundred years later, Ireland kind of did break free. Whether there were angels with swords involved, well, that's another question, but there were Irish fighting the whole time, because not all of them left for France.
All right, is there anybody else on Zoom that has a story? Adrian, do you have one?
Not tonight. I had some things that came up early this week, so I didn't get a chance to prep. Sorry.
Okay. And Anand?
No, John, not this time, maybe next week, next month, sorry, next month, I'll be prepared.
Okay. All right, then I'm gonna put the spotlight here at the Claremont Forum, and who has a story here that would like to go? Ron? Now, I think we found out last time it worked up here.
Okay.
For the lighting. How does that lighting look? Those of you on
It's good.
It's good. Let's compare it to this way.
This is better, John.
Better is better there.
That's okay, we'll put it there. That's better for Ron because then he can face us.
Yeah, well, you know, it's just the nature of the beast. And it is, of course, the time of year when Irish tales are running wild, as a matter of fact. Thursday night, I am telling stories in Orange, and Saturday is the South Coast, or the San Diego Storytelling Festival. I'm hoping to share a tale there. You never know. I'll beat this swap if I can get in. And then on Monday, I'm telling Irish stories at my grandson's school. Wow. Probably my best Irish tale. The very first one I learned off of a 33 RPM record from the Riverside Library is the one I thought I would share tonight. I was recently in Ireland. When I was in Ireland, I found that there really is a town called Ballaghdreen, and that there really was, for many centuries, a chapel that plays the ending of this tale. However, it was destroyed in a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and the statue that is mentioned was lost. So while I'll tell it the way I've always told it, please remember the actual ending is not historically correct anymore. Long, long ago in Northern Ireland, there lived a peddler, a man as carried goods from place to place, selling what he could, buying what he must. He lived at the crossroads between the tiny track that led up into the hills to the town of Ballaghdreen and the great King's Highway that led down to Dublin. And he lived there in a wee bit of a shack. And behind his shack was the garden. But wouldn't I be a telling you that he lived in a wee bit of a shack. I doubt you be taking my meaning, for you see, if he stood in the middle of his little shack, he could, by turning around and stretching all the way back, lift the latch on his back door. Or by stretching all the way forward, lift the latch on his front door. Or by taking a great step to the right, he could pick the kettle off the shelf and set it on the hob. There it is, house in his garden, and at the back of the garden was a great cherry tree, many centuries old. Now, any day the sun was shining or the wind wasn't too terribly fierce, the peddler would be off looking for some place, to sell his wares. And like as not, he'd share his lunch with a mongrel dog or a beggar as he went along. He would, of course, stop and place his wares on the grounds someplace. And it often happened that a beautiful young lass would come by, and she'd look down and see in his wares a silken scarf. And she'd think to herself, if I had that fine scarf in my hair, 'twould be me the boys would be looking at, and the other girls envious they'd be. And so she'd say to him, what do you want for that beautiful scarf? And the peddler would think back to where he'd purchased it, what he'd paid for it, and how long he'd carried it. And he'd say, lassie, I guess we must take that at least crown. Oh, never had such a sum of money at one time in all my life, sir, would say the lass. And she'd mean to walk away. And the peddler would say, lassie, come back. Let's see what we can do. That scarf will look far better in your beautiful hair than it ever has. And he'd sell the scarf for whatever the girl had, even though it was far less than he'd paid for it himself. Or it might happen that a strong, brawny young man would walk by, and he'd see amongst his wares a beautiful pearl-handled clasp knife. And he'd think to himself, if I had that fine knife, I could whittle myself up a whole bunch of useful things. Yay. And he'd say to them, well, sir, what do you want for that beautiful knife? And again, he'd think back to where he'd bought it and how long he'd carried it and say, we best make that at least £1. That's a couple of months' wages for me. Can't afford such a thing. And once again, the peddler would sell it for whatever the lad had. And of course, each fall, as the vegetables began to ripen in the garden, the rabbits and the squirrels, they would come in from all around, and they nibble a little here and nibble a little there, so not a vegetable was worth a thing. And the peddler's mate would say, you're a fool, man. Shoot the rabbits, fence them out. They're eating all your vegetables. Aye, that they are, but the beasts of the field are my friends, and it'd not do for them to be hungry. I get by with it. And each fall, as the cherries in his beautiful cherry tree began to ripen, the birds would fly in from miles around, and they'd peck a cherry there and peck a cherry here, so not a cherry was fit for man or beast. And again, his neighbors would berate him. And again, the peddler would say, aye, it's true, they're taking my cherries. But I say to you, neighbor, they sing for me more sweetly every fall than they do anywhere else in all of Ireland, and I do well enough. Well, of course, it's all very well and nice to be a kind and generous person. But if year by year you make a habit of buying things, selling things for less than what you paid for them yourself, year by year you'll have less to sell. And finally the day came the peddler's neighbors had been warning him about for years. For there was nothing, not a bobbin of thread, not a packet of spice in his backpack. And what's more, since his tree in his garden had produced nothing, he was out of food. And he got up that morning, he looked out at a world with fleecy clouds blowing close from the north and thought, well, old fool, you've no place to go and nothing to be doing today. You might as well stay here. And so he did, walking back and forth in his little house, listening as the wind blew in closer and closer, with nothing to eat and nothing but water. When he awoke the next morning, the first thing he noticed is that he was really rather hungry. But the second was, there was a much louder wind outside his door. And he looked out at a world full of racing gray clouds and thought, well, in good times, I might have gone out on a day like this, but maybe I wouldn't have anyway. You must stay here. That night, as he was tossing and turning in his bed, the back door of his little shop opened up all of itself, and the room was filled with a pale, shimmering green light. And who should stride in but St. Patrick of Ireland himself, all dressed in Highland green and looking mighty fit for a man who had been dead for 200 years. He looked at him and said, Padla, Padla, Padla of Ballaghaderreen, take the road to Dublin town and stand upon the bridge, for there you'll hear what's meant for thee. And the fellow sat up in his bed and looked about, but of course the door was closed, and latched, and there was no light in the room, and dreaming, that's what it is, dreaming. When he awoke the next morning, he looked out at a world with black clouds and thunder in the distance and thought, even in the best of times, I might not do this. And so he stayed there that day as well. Hey, walking back and forth with nothing to eat and nothing but water. And that night, as he lay tossing and turning, feeling his tummy rumble, the front door opened up of itself, and the room was filled with a silvery light. And it's St. Patrick again, dressed in his silvering armor and looking fairly stern. Cadler of Ballaghaderreen, take the road to Dublin town and stand upon the bridge, for there you'll hear what's meant for thee. But when the peddler sat up, of course, the room was cold and dark, and he thought, delirious with cold and hunger, oh, what's to become of you? When he woke up the next morning, the first thing he noticed was he was powerfully hungry, and the second was that a powerful storm had blown in from the north. He looked out at a world full of black clouds and sleet and hail, and thought, there are no circumstances under which any man would go out unprotected in this, and I have no place to go. I shall have to stay here again today. And so he did, walking back and forth, listening to the clash of thunder and lightning, with nothing to eat. And that night, just after full dawn, and before he could even be thinking about going to bed, both the doors of his little shack opened up, and the room was filled with such a bright yellow light he thought the sun had come down for a visit. And in strode St. Patrick of Ireland again, dressed in golden armor. He looked at him and said, Padla, Padla, Padla of Ballaghaderreen, you're commanded! Take the road to Dublin town and stand upon the bridge, for there you'll hear what's meant for thee. The doors were closed, and the room was dark, but this time the peddler doubted not what he'd seen and heard. He picked up his backpack, threw his cloak over his shoulders, and headed out into the stormy night. Now, I don't know how an old man who'd not eaten in 3 days could possibly have walked all the way from Ballaghaderreen to Dublin. It's cold, stormy winter's night. But however he did it, he walked the next day and found him standing right in the middle of the great stone bridge that led into the teeming city of Dublin. But while he saw more people than he knew who were alive on the earth and heard many snatches of conversation, nothing anyone said seemed to have anything to do with an old peddler from the hills. As the sun began to sink in the west, he thought, well, old fool, you're too old and cold and hungry and tired to try and go home. I'll just go out into Dublin and lay down in an alley, and maybe I'll find a way home tomorrow. And so he walked the rest of the way across the bridge. But the moment his foot touched the cobblestone of the city, a voice rang out. Hey, you man! It was the innkeeper who had the beautiful hotel at the head of the bridge. What's with you, man? Hey, I've seen you standing in the middle of that bridge all day long, but You place no wares in front of you, and market is not till Wednesday, and it's 3 blocks over on the left. Have you been touched? Ah, 'tis a long and sad story, he said. The man smiled and said, a story, is it? Well, come inside and tell me your tale, and if I like it, I'll give you your supper and a place for tonight. You looks as if you could be using both. He went inside and began to tell this tale, just as I've been tempted to you. But the first time the word St. Patrick left his lips, the man threw up his arms and said, do I look like the kind of fool to be listening to tales of this sort? Well, listen to what happened to me. Last night, as I lay in my chamber dreaming of the monk's prophet, St. Patrick's came into my bedchamber and he said, innkeeper, innkeeper, take the king's highway to the little town of Belongder Inn. At the crossroads, you'll find a cherry tree, and beneath it is a treasure. Now, have you ever heard such nonsense in all your life? But I suppose you've earned your supper. And the innkeeper went off toward the kitchen. The peddler looked out at the dark night, picked up his back, headed. How an old man could possibly have walked all the way from Dublin to Belongder on a cold, clear winter's night, I don't know. But I suspect he did it by putting one foot ahead of the other and simply refusing to give up. But the next morning dawned clear and bright and found him standing next to his own cherry tree, and leaning against it was a mattock that wasn't his. He'd never seen it before, but he picked it up and he struck at the ground. A cave opened up. It can't have been there. The tree would have blown over 100 years before. But when he reached inside, he pulled out a small chest and broke it open, and there indeed was treasure. Spanish treasure was, gold doubloon, pieces of 8, a fortune to last many a lifetime. Now, I can't be telling you all the kind and wonderful things the peddler did with his newfound wealth. But one thing we know he did for sure. He had his little shack taken down, and he built there at the crossroads a chapel in honor of St. Patrick of Ireland. And when he'd got on to his own just rewards, the grateful townfolk erected a statue of him and inscribed this story on the plaque. And the plaque, statue, and the chapel stood in Northern Ireland for centuries. That much, at least, of this tale is absolute.
Well done. How in the hell do you remember all?
You've asked me this before.
I know.
The answer's the same.
It's-
Okay, I go from key event to key event and fill in the words.
I can't remember what I did last week, honestly. And of course, all who follow that story make us look like amateurs. Thank you.
Well, the thing is, when you find a story that resonates within, you can remember it.
Is that okay?
I mean, that's what it is. If you're trying to learn a story and you're forcing it and it's not really you, it's not going to work.
Okay, that's the difference.
Yeah.
You find that?
Oh, yes. I don't know if you've heard my story about how I became a storyteller, but the phrasing I use for it is listen, imagine, feel, you will remember. It's bad neuroscience, but it's darn good learning theory. The reality is that if you engage your mind and imagination as you're listening to a story and find an emotional connection, those things together will form a memory chain in the back of your head in your long-term memory. And I have literally had children who've grown into adults who walk up to me in Riverside and say, "Dear Mr. Chick, did you tell that story about?" And they will tell me what a story was like that they heard one time as a elementary school child 15, 20 years before. That's the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else here? Okay.
Little background on this one. It's a folk tale. Oh yeah, I gotta look down at my. I gotta stare at myself.
No, you just have to know
Yeah.
where
be
to
aware.
stand and then you talk to us.
I got you. Okay, I can see it. So I'm gonna tell a folk tale, and a little background on it. It's one that I told several years ago when I joined the story group. I had bought Pleasant Despain's. Despain? I think that's his name. He's got a great story folktale book, so I gotten it from there. This is a very short story. I didn't get a chance to practice it much, so that's why I was asking about memory. I literally got it in my head yesterday, so bear with me on that. But it was a test to myself. I'll be speaking for 3 hours on stage later next month, and so I'll be telling a lot of stories from memory. To your point. But anyway, I want to share this story, and I think it has a good life lesson in it for us as well. It's the story of Old Joe and the Carpenter. You see, Old Joe grew up out on a farm, and this was a farm that was very far from the local town. And the farm had been in Old Joe's family for generations, actually. And it was the family business for generations. And as the years went by, the business had started to fade. And Old Joe found himself at a stage of life where he basically just had his best friend, who ironically happened to be his next door neighbor, also on the farm. And that neighbor and Old Joe had literally known each other since they were kids, young boys. And at this point of their lives, sadly, they had lost their spouses. And of course, the children had grown up on the farm, and their children had finally left to start their own lives. And now, at this stage, Old Joe was basically there, and what he had was his best friend, and he had his land. And with that, the two men who were lifelong friends, for the most part, got along very well and did many things together. In essence, that's all they had was each other. But ironically and suddenly, out of nowhere, one day, they got into an argument. And it was very odd for their friendship to get into this argument. In fact, a stray calf had gone on to his neighbor's land, and the neighbor claimed the calf as his own. And Old Joe said, well, wait a minute, to his friend. He said, well, that's, I think, my calf, because that has the markings of a similar cow that I have. And what was an innocuous argument turned into a very large disagreement. Of course, as we get along in life, we tend to have our ego and our pride. And so the stubbornness kicked in with Old Joe and his neighbor. And suddenly they decided that this was worth a fight, and they stopped talking to each other. And several weeks had gone by with them not talking anymore. And finally they got to a point. It was a Saturday morning, and Joe heard a knock at the door, which was odd. He didn't usually have visitors out on the farm so far away from town. And as he opened the door, he discovered a young man there that had some tools over his shoulder, a bit of a twinkle in his eye, friendly look on his face, and a kind voice. And the gentleman introduced himself, and he said, I'm a traveling carpenter. I'm looking for work. I'm passing through town. I would be right grateful if you would give me some work. I promise you I do fantastic work. I can build you just about anything you like. And, well, I'd be grateful. And Joe thought about it. And as I said, the young man looked friendly, the young carpenter. He had that spark in his eye, and that kind way about him made Joe feel comfortable. And so he invited him in, and it had been a while. He could tell that the young man had not had any food. He looked very hungry. Joe had some stew that was on the stove and fed that to him. And they sat in the kitchen, and Joe asked him questions about his background and just kind of heard this young carpenter's journey that he was on. And then suddenly, Joe jumped up and thought to himself, you know, I think I do have something that you could do for me. And he motioned him over to, he said, come look through my kitchen window. And as they looked through the kitchen window, Joe said, you know, do you see that creek running down my property line right there? Well, that creek wasn't there a few weeks ago. You see, my neighbor, he went up to the pond up north on our farms and he dug a hole and plowed it way. And all of a sudden that creek is now running down the middle of our property line. And I know he did it just to spite me. So I'll tell you what, I do have some work for you to do. I want you to build me a big fence. In fact, I don't want to see that creek. I don't want to see my neighbor's property. I don't want to see nothing. And so with that, the young carpenter thought to himself for a moment and thought, okay, well, I think I could do a great job for you, Joe. And so Joe motioned him towards him and they got up and went out to the barn and he said, you know, I've got some supplies and some materials out here for you. I'll tell you what, you just get started on that fence. I'm going to go into town and get some more materials and more supplies so you can finish that. And I'll be back. So off Joe went on his wagon and went into town. And sure enough, the young talented carpenter gathered up the materials from the barn and took his tools and grabbed a few more tools that Joe had and went out to the middle of the property. Well, something ironic started to happen because as the hours ticked by, the young carpenter chose to build something quite interesting. What he decided to build was a bridge. And the bridge started on Joe's property, went across the creek, and went on to his neighbor's property. And it wasn't just any little bridge. It's a beautiful bridge with gorgeous handrails and beautiful posts that he had crafted. It took him all day to do this. Beautiful finishes on the wood. It's that little half bridge over the creek. It's just a beautiful thing. And as the young carpenter wrapped up his work, gathered up his tools, the neighbor ironically came out, started to walk across the bridge. He had this curiosity, well, what is this bridge that's being built on my property and my neighbor's property? Well, ironically enough, Joe came back in from town. And as he approached, he had this interesting look on his face. He had thought, of course, the young carpenter was going to build this big, tall fence and wouldn't have to see the creek. But as old Joe walked up to the bridge, there was his neighbor with his hand stretched out. And the neighbor apologized and said, you know, Joe, I'm so sorry for our disagreement. I'm so happy that you're building this bridge for us to reunite our friendship. I didn't expect this, but you know, I'm so sorry about that calf. That you can have that calf. Of course, Joe at the time now all of a sudden felt really bad as well. He was shocked and surprised, and he walked up to the middle of the bridge, and the two men shook hands and hugged. Lifelong friends were now reunited. And then suddenly, Joe realized that the young carpenter was walking away. He said, but wait, you mustn't go. We've got tons of projects for you and so many things. You're so talented. This bridge is beautiful. The young carpenter with that twinkle in his eye that I mentioned to you earlier just turned around and looked at Joe. Said, you know, I'd love to stay. I really would, Joe. But you see, I've got more bridges I need to build, and I must be on my way. And with that, he grabbed his tools, put them over his shoulder, and he turned and walked away. And I like that story because it reminds us of the power of whether we have our egos and our pride that gets kicked up when we have disagreements, when we can choose to build bridges and make connections with people, connections with things and events. So I've always remembered, maybe I didn't need too much practice on this to remember that story of old Joe and the carpenter and how building bridges is something that can really benefit us in our lives.
Thank you, Glenn. I remember that story.
Yep.
It's a great story. Okay. Guess I have to stand here to be all on it. it's interesting on a night when Glenn tells a folktale, I'm going to tell a personal story.
I was actually going to tell you that. John, you'll appreciate that.
And I'm going to tell a personal story. So about 8 years ago, an anthropology professor from Cal State University, San Bernardino, came to our storytelling. And she was the curator of the anthropology museum there at the university. And she wanted to do a display on a certain time period in Southern California, in the Inland Empire, from, I don't remember the exact years, the 1950 to 1980 or something like that. And she wondered if any of the storytellers in this group had personal tales that they could tell about life in this region at that time. And so a number of us actually did. And Ron, you did one, didn't you? And I did one, and I think Barbara did one. I think Nick did one. That may be it. I don't know if there's anybody else, but she made appointments, and then she recorded us telling the story and built this display there. And so tonight I want to tell you what my story was. So when I was a college student, I needed a good paying summer job because I was going to a private college. I went to Mona College in Claremont. And I was a chemistry major. And there was somebody from our church that was a chemist that worked at Sunkist Products. And so I went to interview at Sunkist thinking, you know, maybe I could get a job as a lab assistant in the lab there. But they didn't have any openings, and they said, well, we could put you on the assembly line in the bottling department, and we'll see what happens if something comes up later. So I took the job, and I worked for 18 days straight because they were trying to catch up with production. And what they did in this department is they bottled Hires root beer and Orange Crush. They also took orange juice that was squeezed at the plant, and they put it in these big wooden barrels to be sent places. In fact, those big wooden barrels full of orange juice, and in fact, we were doing quite a bit of that, were put out at the July 4th All-States Picnic up Euclid Avenue every July 4th. And you got free orange juice out of those big barrels. But the job that I really learned an appreciation for working class people was the bottling line where we bottled Hires root beer and Orange Crush fountain syrup. And it was all automated, but every now and then the machine would get the lid on crooked. So my job was to test every bottle to see if the lid was on tight. And after doing that like 18 days straight, I lost the feeling in this thumb, this finger, and this finger. And fortunately, I was called in by personnel, and they offered me a job as a grapefruit extraction operator because they were starting to get some grapefruit in, and they didn't do much grapefruit. It was mostly oranges. And the lemons were processed in Corona. There was a lemon processing plant. And so they said, they saw I was a college student. They said, well, would you like to try this job? And I said, sure. And it ended up being wonderful. It was a one-person job. I ran the whole operation. There wasn't a large volume of grapefruit. And it was, they would run it 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, one shift. I was it. I squeezed all the grapefruit that came in. And that was kind of an interesting job. then the next summer, I got a different job in the dryer department. And I worked my way up into being a dryer operator. Now, the dryer department takes the rotten oranges and the orange peels after the juice has been squeezed out of them. It's sent on a conveyor belt and chopped up and put into these huge, I would say it was like 15-foot diameter steel drums with a blast furnace blasting in it, and they dump it in, and it would be turning, and it would work its way through getting baked or dried. And that dried peel and whatever, Sunkist sold as cow feed. The cows loved it. And they didn't waste anything. Along the way, when it was sent over and put into bins, a lot of juice and water would drip down. They catch that and they pipe it over to a vat and cook it down to what they call molasses. It was the scrap orange juice, not really fit for human consumption, that was boiled down and rendered into a thick syrup. And as the dried peel came out, they would sprinkle that on top to add a little sweetness to it. And then they'd store it in these huge tanks. Now, if the peel did not get completely dried, it caused a problem because it would hold the heat and it could spontaneously combust. In fact, one day that happened, and the tank it started smoldering, and then it blew and it lifted the tank off the ground and then back down. And the whole tank was it was like coffee grounds. They called the fire department, the fire department put it out, and then it was wet and still smoldering. And I was told I had to get that out of there. Now, there was an auger that went at the bottom to carry it out of the big tank. And, we started shoveling and getting that stuff out. It was still smoldering and stinky. And at one point, we had emptied it out all along the auger, and it was this huge bridge, like 20 feet high, of solid, compacted, burnt, wet orange peel. And we couldn't figure out what to do. And I came up with a brilliant idea. I said, okay, I know where there's some rope. I went and got some rope. I threw it over the top, pulled it under, and he took one end of the rope and I took the other. And we sawed through that bridge of compacted, burnt, wet orange peel. But one thing we did not consider is once we cut through it, what was going to happen? Well, it collapsed. Tons of this stuff came crashing down, and we were inside the tank. And we both turned, he yelled, run, we both turned and ran. He made it out of the tank. I didn't. I was knocked off of my feet and buried up to my waist in the smoldering, wet or burnt orange peel. And he came, he started yelling, John. All he saw was all the smoke come out and no John coming out. He ran in, John, are you okay? And yeah, I'm over here. And he pulled me out and I survived that. But that was quite the experience that I will never forget. And that's my story.
Very nice.
Orange peel.
Yeah.
That's a great story, John. Congratulations on your survival.
Yeah.
Those are, jobs in our youth that, you learn what life really is.
Yeah. And I brought here I saved the display.
Oh, nice.
I don't know whether you guys can see it, but is it backwards? It looks like it's backwards.
No, it's fine.
No,
No, no,
it's fine.
good.
Oh, because I can't, when I see it on the screen, it's like mirror image. Anyway, I
Wow.
brought this, which I can pass around, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's the end of our stories.
I didn't know
That
you.
mirror image thing is something that Zoom does for the viewer for some reason.
Mm, mhm.
Yeah, it was a mirror image as I saw, but you guys could actually see it.
No,
Yes.
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
that-
like would be a page on the computer, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. And before we end the Zoom session, I want to remind everyone that April's a big month. April 6th is our spring concert. And it's in the afternoon. You don't have to drive at night. It's from 2 to 4 in the afternoon on April 6th. If you go to our website at inlandstorytellers.org, it will have all the information. I haven't posted who's telling stories yet, but we're finalizing that as to which storytellers will be performing. There will probably be 8 of us. And it'll be a whole afternoon of wonderful stories. And we'll have free refreshments at the end. And hopefully everyone can talk it up and we get a good turnout.
It
Yeah.
is at the friend's house?
It's at the Friends
Friends.
Meeting House, yes,
Yeah.
in Claremont on Harrison.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where we do our spring events. And also in April is the Southern California Story Swap Festival,
Mm.
which is the last Saturday of April. And that is going to be in Orange County.
St. Paul's Episcopal Church, 1221 Ross Avenue,
What city?
Tustin.
Okay, so it's in Tustin at St. Paul's
St. Paul's Episcopal
Episcopal Church.
A
Okay.
and 1221 WAS, WAAS.
1221 WAS, WASS. AAS. Okay.
Can you put this also on the website as an announcement?
Yeah, and
The swap, the story swap.
yeah, I will. And I'll send it out in an email when I will hopefully write up a summary of this meeting and send out that. And then also this month, this Saturday, is the San Diego Storytelling Festival. And Chris and I are going there, and we're taking Angela Lloyd with us. And it's at the Coronado Public Library.
They change it.
Yeah, it's not in Encinitas yet anymore, so it's a longer drive for us because it's all the way down to the Coronado Island. But it's a beautiful library, and they always have great storytellers, and it's a free event. It doesn't cost anything.
No.
And it's a whole day of stories and workshops as well.
Mhm.
So it's an excellent event. And if you have nothing else to do this Saturday, I highly recommend it.
Okay.
And Nick, do you have anything else
Well, actually, there's one thing I want to mention that I will probably be doing one of the workshops for the Story Swapping Festival on the 27th.
Oh, okay.
They asked me to propose something because they wanted me to do a workshop, and I proposed something, and I haven't heard back yes or no about whether that idea is accepted. But if it is, I'll be doing one of the workshops there.
Good.
Oh,
And I don't know for sure, but the one that I proposed was doing something related to doing historical storytelling, which is kind of a specialty area of mine because I end up doing a lot of that for non-storytelling audiences, which is an interesting thing.
You have something to add, Ron?
Well, I got an email from the church today that they may have to hold a funeral that day, in which case this whole event may be canceled unless we can find some place to hold it. It may not be the 33rd annual event. The whole thing could fall completely apart. We have sold about 30 tickets. and I don't know what the hell's gonna happen.
I received nothing about,
Hmm.
yeah. I have received nothing about it.
Here.
How do you sell tickets?
Well, I mean, most, well, most of the people from the San Diego Storytelling Festival, they are coming up. They got, a lot of them are there. Some
Yeah.
of them are other people that are interested in just listening. But I don't know if it's gonna happen at all. And I don't know if there's any place else we can find to put it on. And if it
Kinda
gets
late
canceled
notice.
out, what am I supposed to do? The church member who passed away, her family can only get there on that week. They're coming from across the United States, and guess what? A grieving family expects to get comfort from their church.
Yes.
How many, I may have an option, how long is the event?
Well, it's planned for 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'd probably be setting up about 9 a.m. and probably be cleaning up at about 4:30.
On what day?
Saturday, the 27th of April.
Last Saturday, we.
If I found your location in Mission Viejo, would that be too far?
Mission Viejo could be on the other side of the moon, but any place that's down in Orange County somewhere.
Yeah, Mission Viejo, South
Yes.
Georgia.
Oh yeah, that won't be any problem at all.
All right, let me make a call.
Yeah, because the host storytelling group is South Coast.
Yeah, I know,
Storytelling.
yeah. So I was thinking, yeah, but let me make a phone call.
I literally just got this word this afternoon. I thought I'll mention it to people tonight. I was going to see if I could get Ron Evans's phone number. I don't have it, and see if perhaps we could shift it up here. We've got our food planned. We have at least 2 workshops pretty much in order. And I'd hate for it to die. So
Yeah. Well, Ron is no longer really connected with the Friends meeting. I've been dealing, I could give you the name and email address of the person that I dealt with to reserve it for our spring concert and last spring for the Story Swap Festival. I can send that to you.
I would love to have a solution. This literally sprung on me this afternoon.
But it'd be better if you could get the Mission Viejo one,
Yeah.
because the host group is in Orange County, not over here.
Yeah, I'll make a phone call tomorrow.
I think, is there any other announcements by anybody? If not, I think I'm gonna stop the recording.